October 21st, 1976. Queens, New York. Hundreds of mourners gathered after the death of Carlo Gambino, the longtime leader of what federal investigators identified as one of the most powerful organized crime families in the United States. Newspapers, law enforcement officers, and organized crime researchers all noted the extraordinary turnout. Publicly, it was the funeral of an aging businessman who had lived quietly. Behind that appearance, authorities believe they were watching one of the most significant transitions in American mafia history. For nearly 2 decades, Gambino had maintained a remarkably stable leadership compared with many of his rivals. Following the violent upheavals that reshaped New York organized crime during the late 1950s and early 1960s, he became known for avoiding unnecessary public attention. According to multiple documented investigations, his administration emphasized profit, discipline, and insulation from law enforcement rather than public displays of violence. That approach helped strengthen the family's influence in labor unions, construction, trucking, waterfront operations, garment businesses, and illegal gambling. Unlike several previous mafia successions, Gambino's death was not the result of an assassination or a federal prison sentence. He died from natural causes at his home after a period of declining health. His passing created something that investigators had anticipated for years: a rare opportunity to observe how one of the nation's most influential crime organizations would choose its next leader without open warfare. The answer did not come through any public announcement. It emerged through the traditions of the American mafia itself. Federal intelligence gathered over many years indicated that succession inside a mafia family depended less upon popularity than upon authority, alliances, and recognition by other senior members. While every family possessed its own internal dynamics, leadership transitions typically required acceptance among influential captains and acknowledgement throughout the national mafia structure, commonly referred to by investigators as the Commission. Much of that process occurred beyond the reach of police surveillance. At the center of growing attention stood 2 very different figures. One was Paul Castellano, Gambino's brother-in-law. Castellano had developed a reputation for focusing on business interests, white-collar racketeering, food distribution, construction, and corporate infiltration. Federal prosecutors would later describe him as a sophisticated organizer whose influence extended well beyond traditional street crime. The other was Aniello Delacroce. Delacroce represented another side of the organization. Long identified by investigators as an influential underboss, he commanded deep loyalty among numerous street-level members and captains. Law enforcement reports frequently described him as respected by experienced soldiers who viewed him as a traditional mafia leader with extensive authority over the family's enforcement wing. Many observers expected that Delacroce, because of his senior position, might eventually assume overall leadership. That did not happen. Verified crime historians, including authors who relied upon court records and investigative files, agree that Gambino designated Castellano as his successor before his death. Exactly how that decision was communicated internally remains only partially documented, and responsible historical accounts avoid inventing private conversations. What is firmly established is that Castellano ultimately became boss while Delacroce accepted the position of underboss, preserving an uneasy balance inside the organization. The arrangement prevented an immediate internal conflict. It did not eliminate underlying divisions. Federal investigators increasingly noticed that the Gambino family appeared to contain 2 distinct centers of influence. Castellano directed major economic enterprises and high-level administration. Delacroce retained enormous personal loyalty among members whose backgrounds reflected older mafia traditions centered on neighborhood crews, loan sharking, gambling, and street enforcement. That difference would shape the family's future. During the late 1970s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation intensified its campaign against organized crime nationwide. Long-term surveillance, confidential informants, electronic monitoring authorized through court orders, financial investigations, and coordinated intelligence sharing became increasingly sophisticated. Organized crime families that once relied upon secrecy found themselves operating under growing federal scrutiny. The Gambino organization was no exception. Agents documented meetings, monitored known social clubs, photographed suspected members, and attempted to map relationships that had remained hidden for decades. Although investigators rarely possessed a complete picture, each surveillance operation added another piece to an expanding intelligence network. Meanwhile, Castellano sought to reinforce centralized authority. Documented accounts portray him as favoring a structured hierarchy that emphasized permission for significant criminal ventures and strict control over profitable enterprises. Prosecutors later argued that this management style reflected an effort to reduce unnecessary exposure while maximizing revenue from established racketeering operations. Not everyone welcomed those changes. Evidence presented in later court proceedings and supported by numerous historical works indicates that some members viewed Castellano as increasingly distant from the traditional street culture that had long characterized the family. Resentment did not immediately become rebellion, but investigators would later conclude that dissatisfaction quietly accumulated during these years. Among those operating under Delacroix's influence was a rapidly rising captain named John Gotti. At that stage, Gotti had not yet become the internationally recognized mafia figure he would later become. Federal authorities knew him primarily through investigations involving hijackings, gambling, and associations with Gambino members in Brooklyn and Queens. His growing reputation existed largely within organized crime circles rather than among the general public. Delacroix's continued authority proved critical. As long as he remained alive and loyal to the official administration, historians generally agree that internal stability held. His personal standing discouraged open challenges against Castellano despite underlying disagreements. The family's two power centers existed together, bound by tradition and mutual necessity rather than complete unity. Outside observers saw little of this hidden structure. The funeral had ended. The black automobiles disappeared. Newspaper coverage faded. Yet federal investigators understood that the death of Carlo Gambino had begun a new chapter rather than concluded an old one. Leadership transitions inside mafia families often unfolded slowly, through years of shifting loyalties instead of dramatic public confrontations. The consequences of decisions made during this period would not become fully visible until the following decade. Throughout the early 1980s, surveillance files continued to grow. Organized crime strike forces coordinated prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions. Informants from other investigations supplied fragments of intelligence about changing alliances. No single report revealed the complete picture, but together they suggested increasing tension beneath the surface of the Gambino organization. Then another documented event fundamentally altered the balance that Gambino's succession had preserved for years. On December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Delacroix died after battling cancer. His death removed the one figure widely recognized by investigators and historians as the bridge between Castellano's administration and the family's traditional street faction. Within days, federal surveillance teams began paying even closer attention. The balance established after Carlo Gambino's funeral no longer existed. And according to the historical record, the next funeral would not merely mark the end of a powerful mafia leader. It would become the opening act of one of the most consequential power shifts in the history of the Gambino crime family. December 2nd, 1985, Aniello Delacroix's death immediately removed the unofficial balance that had existed inside the Gambino crime family for nearly a decade. According to later federal investigations and numerous verified historical accounts, his presence had discouraged open resistance to Paul Castellano's authority. Once Delacroix was gone, the restraint disappeared. Law enforcement agencies monitoring the family recognized that the internal political landscape had shifted almost overnight. Paul Castellano now stood without the influential underboss whose loyalty had helped maintain unity between two very different factions of the organization. Castellano remained the officially recognized boss, but federal intelligence increasingly suggested that dissatisfaction among some captains and soldiers had deepened. Those divisions centered on leadership style, control over lucrative racketeering operations, and Castellano's increasingly centralized management of the family's affairs. Another issue further complicated the situation. During the early 1980s, federal investigators intensified efforts against New York's five families through electronic surveillance and complex conspiracy cases. Castellano himself had become a major target. Court-authorized surveillance, including recordings later introduced in federal proceedings, captured conversations that prosecutors argued demonstrated his continuing authority over criminal enterprises. His legal exposure was growing at precisely the moment internal confidence was weakening. Among those drawing increasing attention from investigators was John Gotti. By this point, Gotti had established himself as a powerful captain operating primarily from crews based in Queens and Brooklyn. FBI files connected him to hijacking investigations, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, and other racketeering activities. Although respected by many within Delacroix's faction, he was also viewed by law enforcement as an ambitious figure whose influence continued to expand after his mentor's death. According to testimony presented years later by cooperating witnesses and supported by multiple organized crime historians, Gotti and several trusted associates concluded that Castellano's leadership threatened both their interests and their future within the organization. Precisely when every conversation occurred cannot be established with complete certainty, and responsible historical accounts avoid reconstructing undocumented discussions. What is firmly supported by court testimony is that a conspiracy emerged to eliminate the boss. The target was selected carefully. Castellano routinely traveled between his Staten Island residence and meetings in Manhattan. Investigators later determined that his schedule provided limited opportunities for an attack in public, while minimizing risks to the conspirators. Surveillance conducted after the murder suggested the participants had studied his movements in advance. The chosen location would become one of the most recognizable crime scenes in mafia history. December 16, 1985. Outside Spark Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, Paul Castellano arrived that evening accompanied by his driver and longtime associate, Thomas Bellotti. Bellotti had recently been elevated to underboss, a decision that, according to several historical sources, further alienated influential members who believed more experienced figures had been bypassed. As Castellano's vehicle stopped outside the restaurant, gunmen moved into position. Federal investigators later concluded that multiple shooters participated in the coordinated attack. Both Castellano and Bellotti were struck numerous times and died at the scene. Witnesses immediately contacted police, and the heavily traveled Manhattan intersection became an active homicide investigation within minutes. The assassination stunned law enforcement. Unlike many organized crime killings that involved lower-ranking figures, this was the public execution of the officially recognized boss of the Gambino crime family in one of New York City's busiest commercial districts. Detectives from the New York City Police Department joined federal agents already investigating organized crime. Crime scene technicians recovered ballistic evidence, interviewed witnesses, and began reconstructing the sequence of events. No immediate arrests followed. The planners had left little direct physical evidence linking themselves to the shooting. Even before investigators identified every participant, experienced organized crime analysts recognized the broader significance. Mafia tradition generally discouraged unauthorized attacks on a sitting boss because such actions risked destabilizing relationships among the five families. The Castellano murder therefore represented not simply a homicide, but a challenge to long-established organizational rules. Within days, observers noticed another development. John Gotti increasingly appeared at locations associated with Gambino leadership. Federal surveillance reports documented meetings involving prominent captains and members. Investigators interpreted these gatherings as evidence that support was rapidly consolidating around Gotti. While internal mafia recognition occurred privately, subsequent testimony from cooperating witnesses established that Gotti effectively assumed control of the family shortly after Castellano's death. The transition happened with remarkable speed. Unlike earlier succession periods marked by prolonged uncertainty, this shift produced an identifiable new leadership almost immediately. Historians generally attribute that outcome to the alliances Gotti had cultivated over many years within Delacroix's network. The consequences extended beyond the Gambino organization. Other mafia families carefully evaluated the situation. Verified accounts indicate that questions arose regarding whether the killing had received prior approval through traditional channels. Exactly how those deliberations unfolded remains only partially documented, but subsequent testimony suggests that concerns existed regarding both the precedent established by the assassination and Gotti's rapid consolidation of power. Federal authorities viewed events differently. For prosecutors already pursuing extensive racketeering investigations, the murder reinforced their assessment that organized crime leadership remained willing to employ lethal violence despite increasing law enforcement pressure. Resources devoted to Gambino investigations expanded. Intelligence units intensified surveillance of known social clubs, residences, businesses, and meeting places associated with the family's emerging administration. At the same time, another major federal prosecution continued moving forward. The commission case had already brought unprecedented charges against leading members of New York's organized crime leadership under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Although Paul Castellano had been named among the defendants before his death, his murder fundamentally altered the future course of both the Gambino family and portions of the prosecution. John Gotti's public profile also began changing. Unlike Carlo Gambino or Paul Castellano, whose leadership styles generally emphasized discretion, Gotti attracted considerable media attention. Frequent appearances outside social clubs, interactions with reporters, and highly visible court appearances gradually transformed him into the most recognizable mafia figure in America. That visibility generated enormous publicity, but also provided investigators with expanded opportunities for surveillance and documentation. According to later FBI assessments, the Gambino family, under Gotti, entered a period unlike any previous administration. Traditional secrecy increasingly competed with unprecedented public attention. 4 federal agents who had spent years attempting to penetrate organized crime's closed structure. This transformation presented both new challenges and unexpected opportunities. The funeral of Carlo Gambino had quietly transferred authority through established succession. The murder of Paul Castellano accomplished the next transfer through gunfire. One transition reflected institutional continuity. The other permanently altered the balance of power inside New York's organized crime world. Yet the victory proved far less secure than it first appeared. As Gotti settled into leadership, the FBI was already assembling one of the most aggressive investigations ever directed against a mafia boss. Hidden microphones, confidential informants, electronic surveillance, financial evidence, and eventually betrayal from within his own inner circle would combine into a case that prosecutors believed could accomplish what decades of earlier investigations had failed to achieve. The empire created after the funeral had reached its height. Its downfall was already beginning. The empire created after the funeral had reached its height. Its downfall was already beginning. Throughout the second half of the 1980s, the Federal Bureau of Investigation concentrated extraordinary resources on the Gambino crime family. Agents assigned to organized crime squads had spent years building intelligence through surveillance, financial analysis, confidential informants, and court-authorized electronic monitoring. Previous prosecutions had weakened mafia leadership across New York, but investigators believed the Gambino family remained one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. John Gotti quickly became their highest-profile target. Unlike many earlier mafia bosses who deliberately avoided publicity, Gotti's frequent public appearances attracted extensive media coverage. Newspapers labeled him the Dapper Don because of his tailored suits and confident courtroom appearances. Following several acquittals in state and federal cases during the late 1980s, another nickname emerged, the Teflon Don, reflecting the perception that criminal charges failed to stick. Federal investigators saw those acquittals differently. They concluded that traditional investigative methods were not enough. Prosecutors increasingly relied upon the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, allowing multiple criminal acts to be presented as part of an ongoing enterprise. The strategy required not only eyewitness testimony, but also extensive documentary evidence, intercepted conversations, financial records, and insider cooperation. A breakthrough came through long-term electronic surveillance. The FBI secretly installed listening devices inside the apartment above the Rave Night Social Club in Manhattan, a location regularly used for meetings involving Gotti and senior members of the Gambino family. According to court records, those recordings captured conversations concerning the administration of the organization, disputes among members, and discussions relevant to federal racketeering charges. For investigators, the recordings were invaluable. Unlike informant recollections years after the fact, the surveillance preserved contemporaneous conversations that prosecutors later introduced as evidence. The tapes also helped establish the hierarchy of the Gambino family and Gotti's leadership role, strengthening the government's case under RICO statutes. Another decisive development followed. Salvatore Gravano, better known as Sammy Gravano, had risen to the position of underboss after Gotti consolidated control of the family. Gravano participated in numerous criminal activities over many years and was himself facing overwhelming federal charges. During the investigation, prosecutors presented evidence from surveillance recordings that suggested Gotti had discussed responsibility for crimes in ways that increased Gravano's own legal exposure. Confronted with the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, Gravano made a historic decision. He agreed to cooperate with the federal government. According to court testimony, Gravano admitted involvement in multiple murders and extensive racketeering activity while providing detailed information about the Gambino family's internal operations. His cooperation represented one of the most significant defections in the history of the American mafia. Previous informants had supplied valuable intelligence, but very few individuals of Gravano's rank had agreed to testify against an active boss. The government's case now rested upon multiple forms of evidence: electronic surveillance, recorded conversations, financial documentation, physical surveillance, and the testimony of a former underboss. The trial of John Gotti and co-defendant Frank Locascio began in federal court in 1992. Prosecutors alleged that Gotti directed a continuing criminal enterprise responsible for murder, illegal gambling, loan sharking, obstruction of justice, labor racketeering, and other offenses. Rather than depending upon a single witness or isolated incident, the government presented years of accumulated evidence. Gravano's testimony became a central component of the prosecution. He described the structure of the Gambino family, identified participants in criminal activities, and explained how major decisions were made. Defense attorneys challenged his credibility, emphasizing his admitted participation in serious crimes. Prosecutors acknowledged his criminal history, while arguing that his statements were independently supported by recordings and other evidence gathered during the investigation. The jury ultimately accepted the government's case. On April 2, 1992, John Gotti was convicted on numerous federal charges, including racketeering, murder-related offenses, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax violations. He received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Frank Locascio was also convicted and received a life sentence. The verdict marked one of the most significant victories ever achieved by federal prosecutors against the leadership of a New York mafia family. Gotti was transferred to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, and later to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, where he spent much of his sentence under highly restrictive conditions. His influence over day-to-day family operations steadily declined as incarceration, limited communication, and federal authorities monitored remaining associates. Meanwhile, Salvatore Gravano entered the Federal Witness Security Program after his testimony. His cooperation contributed not only to Gotti's conviction, but also to numerous additional prosecutions involving organized crime. Gravano later left witness protection and, years afterward, served prison time in Arizona on unrelated state drug charges stemming from ecstasy trafficking. The Gambino family itself survived, but it emerged fundamentally changed. Leadership became less public. Communication grew more cautious. The conspicuous style associated with the Gotti years largely disappeared. According to organized crime historians and former investigators, the conviction reinforced a lesson many mafia leaders had long understood. Public visibility created investigative opportunities that disciplined secrecy had once minimized. The broader campaign against organized crime continued. The success of the commission case, combined with prosecutions supported by cooperating witnesses such as Gravano, accelerated the decline of the traditional mafia hierarchy that had dominated organized crime in New York for decades. Federal agencies increasingly combined RICO prosecutions, electronic surveillance, financial investigations, and witness cooperation into coordinated strategies that proved difficult for criminal organizations to overcome. As for the principal figures in this story, the documented historical record is clear. Carlo Gambino died of natural causes on October 15, 1976, after naming Paul Castellano as his successor. Paul Castellano was assassinated outside Spark Steakhouse on December 16, 1985. Thomas Bellotti was killed beside him in the same attack. Aniello Delacroce died from cancer on December 2, 1985, only weeks before the assassination that reshaped the Gambino family. John Gotti was convicted in federal court in 1992 and remained imprisoned until his death from throat cancer on June 10, 2002, at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Salvatore Gravano became one of the highest-ranking mafia members ever to testify for the government, permanently altering the course of organized crime investigations in the United States. The funeral that followed Carlo Gambino's death appeared, at the time, to be a peaceful transfer of power. History proved otherwise. That succession established a leadership structure that held for nearly a decade before collapsing in violence outside a Manhattan steakhouse. The assassination that followed elevated a new generation of leadership, but it also intensified federal attention at exactly the moment investigators possessed stronger legal tools, more sophisticated surveillance techniques, and an increasing willingness among insiders to cooperate. In the end, the struggle for control of one mafia empire did not preserve its strength. It exposed its vulnerabilities. The funerals, the promotions, the betrayals, the indictments, and the convictions were not isolated events. Together, they marked the gradual dismantling of an organization that federal authorities had pursued for generations. The documented record leaves little room for mythology. Behind the rituals of loyalty and power stood an organization ultimately weakened not by a rival family, but by relentless investigation, recorded evidence, and the testimony of its own senior leadership. That remains one of the defining lessons in the modern history of American organized crime.